Buckle up. We're talking college football realignment. We're going to get serious. Here's the map. Take it in. We will refer to it. It matters, but it matters very little. Now, this is what matters right here. This is the revenue projection for college football conferences. I'm going to tell you right now it's inaccurate because some of these conferences will not be here in 2029 or 2026 even. Look, Mark Yuda of the SEC has set a goal, and apparently the SEC has entered in talks with Florida State and Clemson, and they've set a goal to get 20 teams in the conference. The Big Ten will follow suit. Look, they are projected to outgross the SEC in 2022 already, and will likely look at how much it grows in 2024. The reason for that is USC and UCLA join the conference. Then the SEC catches up in 2025 when they add Oklahoma and Texas. So, here's what it comes down to. And the reason they're outgrossing the SEC is outgrossing the Big Ten in 2026. Well, let's just get into that right now. They're going to have pods. They're going to broker a deal. We'll get into the pods later. They're going to broker a deal with ESPN. Their CBS rights are going to run up. And then they broker a deal with ESPN, and then they'll have network like Disney Plus will have access to some of the SEC networks and things like that, and be able to put that on their streaming service. And Hulu will definitely have access to the streaming service. That'll be part of the SEC's deal, because they'll have the SEC networks, because there'll be multiple SEC channels through ESPN and Hulu and Disney Plus. And it's because they're going to have 20 teams. Put 5 teams in a pod. So you're going to play 10 conference games. 4 of your pod, 1 rotating from the other 4 pods, and then 1 protected rival from the other pod, and then 2 non-conference games. Then you will play to determine a conference championship. It'll be seeded. The top whoever comes out of each pod will be seeded 1 through 4, and based on conference record, and then whoever wins the first game, it'll be a 4-team playoff. Mark has already talked about creating his own playoff. Well, guess what? The SEC's done that for their own conference championship. And the NCAA, they're going to go down in flames because Brett Kavanaugh has already said, that Supreme Court Justice here, that's who we're talking about, that they've already ruled against the NCAA and antitrust laws, and he's quoted that they're not above the law and things like that. And of course, one of the biggest sightings in antitrust laws was when J.P. Morgan lost to the U.S. government when Roosevelt was president. And of course, we know that Standard Oil was broken up. Well, guess what? The NCAA is going to break up, but it's not going to go to little, mini NCAAs. It's going to be the conferences that run college football, and it's going to be multiple conferences. It's going to be the SEC and the Big Ten. Those are going to be the Power 2 that run college football. Then you'll have smaller conferences, and the other conferences won't have the power, but they will create a 4-team playoff with probably an automatic bid for the SEC champion and the Big Ten champion, and then 2 at-large bids to be determined by our college football playoff committee of probably 15 people. And without further ado, here's what the 4 pods of the SEC will likely look like by 2026. So here's pod 1. You'll have South Carolina, Georgia, Florida State, Clemson, and Florida. The reason they're going to get some of the teams from the ACC is because even though Jim Phillips, has prioritized football and only football, he has not prioritized the TV deal, and it's just going to, if he loses these 2 big brands, it's just going to lead to the conference collapsing probably by next summer, similar to how the Pac-12 is collapsing right now. So Florida State, their 10 games would be something like they would play their pod. So they play Florida, Clemson, Georgia, and South Carolina, and then they get 2 other games, 2 from each pod, and 1 will be a protected rival, and I'll get into that, why that's important later. Next pod. So Southern Methodist, look, they've got to find a local team. It may not be Southern Methodist. They may go with somebody else. They may try to poach a bigger brand than this, but Southern Methodist does have, the heart of the Dallas market. It just TV money-wise, it makes sense. And where other teams are, it's the one that makes sense. And then this is what your pod looks like. A&M, Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri and Southern Methodist. You play the teams in your pod, and then like A&M would play Florida State and South Carolina. Then here's the next pod. And you get Auburn, Alabama, LSU, and Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Then Tennessee, Arkansas, Vanderbilt, Louisville is the other team that they add, and Kentucky. And you have a protected rival. So Tennessee could play Alabama as a protected rival in this pod, and maybe their protected rival in this pod's Oklahoma, and maybe their protected rival in this pod is South Carolina. And then they rotate through. So Tennessee would play South Carolina and Florida, Oklahoma and A&M, Alabama and Auburn, and then they would play Kentucky, Arkansas, Vanderbilt, and Louisville, and then 2 non-conference games. And if you finish the highest in your pod, you go on to the playoff and to the SEC playoff. And whoever wins the SEC gets an automatic bid in the college football playoff. Now the Big Ten, they're already talking about, they've already got a big deal with Fox, where the SEC, when that deal runs up, CBS will be looking for a new contract. They will likely go to the Big Ten to broker a deal. And then Netflix will do off-the-field content, NIL, things like that to help bolster the Big Ten. And if the SEC is going to have their playoff, I guarantee you the Big Ten needs to do the same. So they're going to get to 20 teams as well. And here's what those pods look like. Now, Pod 1 has Indiana and Purdue, Illinois and Northwestern, and Wisconsin. And I know you don't see any added teams yet. Now, like I said, the ACC is kind of going under. So 2 teams you add, Pittsburgh and Boston College. Leads to Pod 2, Maryland, Rutgers, Boston College, Penn State, and Pittsburgh. Now, Pod 3. It'll probably be called the Pod of Death in college football, but Michigan, Ohio State, Michigan State, Nebraska, and Iowa. Then Pod 4. Eventually, they have to cave. They have to bring in the Seattle market, Washington, and I know they've kind of snubbed Oregon and things like that, but it just makes sense that before they broker this deal with the Big 12, that the Big 10 ends up bringing them in and getting their 20 teams. So that this pot has USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and Minnesota. And Minnesota would play these 4 games. Then they'd have their protected rivals in each pod. Maybe that's Iowa for this pod, and then you get a rotating game here. And then protected rival, maybe that's Penn State and a rotating game. Protected rival like Wisconsin and then a rotating game. So even with this pod system, Minnesota could still get their rivalry games and the majority of them each year, and you're getting 10 conference games, and if you end up winning, having the best record in the conference in your pod, you go to this playoff, and then if you win the Big 10, you go to the college football playoff. Now the Big 12. The Big 12 already has Big 12 now with ESPN Plus and a deal with Fox, and are looking to broker a TV deal with Apple. Look, they won't necessarily be considered a power conference by many. It'll be much like the American conferences today. Like they even made a commercial, the Power 6 with the American Conference. And every time that came on, if we weren't a big American Conference guy, we kind of just laughed like, yeah, sure you are. But they're also going to try to get to 20 schools. They're negotiating with Washington and Oregon, probably as you're watching this video right now. They're going to negotiate with other schools. They're trying to bring in other Pac-12 schools and ACC schools. Well, their big market, I know the basketball market isn't as big as the football market, is to create the basketball conference, which is what it'll likely be with the ACC breaking down. Is the poached team. They've already poached some teams from the American Conference. So here's what it would look like. Here's their pods. So pod 1, you get Kansas, Kansas State, Cincinnati, which they've already agreed to add in 2023, and Iowa State. Then they add Memphis, poaching them from the American Conference, just to have them in the conference come basketball season, just to broker some TV deals. Like they might do a Disney Plus basketball season deal, things like that. Big deals for basketball season, things like that. Now pod 2, like I said, the ACC has disintegrated. They've already got Central Florida coming in, home of Taco Fall. They've got West Virginia, Press Virginia. Then North Carolina and Duke, the biggest rivalry in college basketball. The Qs, this is pod 2. We're all teams that are kind of East Coast. And then the next pod, Texas and Oklahoma. Houston's been in the Final Four recently. Texas Tech, Final Four. Baylor's won a national championship. TCU in basketball. Talking basketball. TCU, they've really been ramped up and things like that. Cade Cunningham played number 1 draft pick from Oklahoma State in the last couple of years. So big pod, nice little pod. All makes sense. Basketball teams, Then You get BYU and Utah comes in from the Pac-12. It makes sense. They're trying to get the Arizona teams. It makes sense. It's better than being left out in the cold. Colorado's already been in the Big 12. Makes sense for them to join. This is your pod. The same system. The only thing that the Big 12 might do different is only one crossover rotating game. So you play 9 conference games and 3 in the non-conference. So that your record might look a little bit better than some of those other teams trying to get because they only need to get an at-large bid to the college football playoff. Now, the independents. There are going to be quite a few, and Notre Dame will have a deal with Peacock and likely NBC. ESPN Plus will do a deal with several of these teams, and ESPN will do a side deal with some of these teams. So these are your 6 independents. Notre Dame's going to remain independent no matter what. They would need to get all these teams would need to get an at-large bid to the college football playoff, and you'll just have to have a better record than the Big 12 champ and the other conference conference teams out there. So it'll probably, the way I've got it set up is the Power 2 and the Group of 2. And I've already done one of those teams, and I'll do the other one in a minute. But Miami, you schedule a bunch of different teams. They used to be independent. Georgia Tech's been independent before. Army's still independent. UConn's independent. New Mexico State and UMass are currently independent. Oregon State and Washington State, they just can't get into a conference. They just have to go independent. That's kind of the way it winds up. Now, the American Conference would be the other conference that can stay in what we call Division 1. And it'll be like an extreme Division 1, as the NCAA will almost no longer be an entity for Division 1. It'll be an entity for what we now know as the FCS, and it'll still run things like that. But it won't have a hand in Division 1 because of all the NIL things. The American gets a deal with Bally Sports and NBC, and then their pods. They are already bringing in Rice, North Texas, and UTSA, and it makes sense for them to try to go for the California market, bringing in Stanford and Cal. So this would be Pod 1. Pod 2, Jacksonville State is set to move up, and they've upset Florida State, things like that. Makes sense to get them in. They're already bringing in UAB and Charlotte, and they get Troy, and this is Pod 2. Pod 3, they suck up NC State and Wake Forest from the Pac-12, not wanting to be independent. And then, of course, they've already got, they're bringing in FAU already, and then South Florida and Tulane already in the conference. So this is Pod 3. Now, Pod 4, they suck Liberty in from the independents. They get the 2 Virginia schools from the ACC to come in because like I say, when the Big East disintegrated, went to FCS, the American Conference formed and absorbed a lot of those teams. And then they bring in Liberty from the independents to get that extra team. And then Navy and Temple already in the conference. And this is kind of a Northeast division, the Northeast pod. Same system probably as the Big 12, where you're only playing 9 conference games so you can have a better record at the end of the season. Now, the other teams that are currently in Division 1 will wind up in one of these conferences, and these conferences will go to FCS Division I, where they will actually have a shot at a national championship in college football, the Sun Belt, the MAC, the Mountain West, and Conference USA. And it's just because they just won't make it. College football for the major, for it probably won't be called FCS and FBS anymore. It'll probably be called NCAA Division I is probably what this will be called. And for football and major, what we know as Division I will be like we've heard the Alliance of College Football. It'll be like that. It'll be Division I, SEC, Big Ten, and your conference name will be there because it'll be the conference entities running college football, not the NCAA. Thanks to Justice Kavanaugh. I'm Josh George. This is my conference realignment video.